Have you ever seen something in the woods that made no sense? Something so out of place it felt like it shouldn't exist. Like a set of stairs just standing there in the middle of nowhere. No house, no building, just stairs. That's what happened to us. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at the woods the same way again. This story starts like most horror stories do, with a group of friends, a bad decision, and a place we shouldn't have been. We were just a bunch of teenagers looking for a fun weekend camping trip. You know, the usual bonfires, ghost stories, and maybe a little too much junk food. But what we found, it wasn't fun. It wasn't a game. And by the time we realized how dangerous it was already too late. This is what happened. It was the summer before our senior year, and we'd all been planning this camping trip for months. There were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, my cousin Mia, and our friend Chris. We'd picked this spot deep in the woods because it was supposed to be quiet, secluded, perfect for a weekend away from parents, school, and all the stress that came with it. But the second we got there, something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, almost suffocating silence. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just because we were so far out. But then, on the second day, we found them. The stairs. They were old, made of cracked stone and covered in moss. Just standing there, in the middle of nowhere. No explanation, no reason for them to be there. It was like they'd been dropped out of the sky. We all just stood there, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. "What the hell are these doing here?" Jake asked, kicking one of the steps. "Maybe it's like an old ruin or something?" Sarah suggested, but even she didn't sound convinced. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. There was something about those stairs that made my skin crawl. They didn't belong there, and the longer I looked at them, the more I felt like they were watching us. We all agreed to stay away from them, but one of us didn't listen. That night, we were sitting around the campfire, trying to shake off the weird vibe from earlier. We'd told ghost stories, laughed, and even made s'mores, but the mood was still off. Everyone kept glancing toward the woods like we were all thinking about the stairs, but too afraid to bring them up. Chris was quieter than usual. He'd been acting strange ever since we found the stairs, but whenever we asked him about it, he just shrugged it off. "I'm fine," he'd say, "just tired." We should have pushed harder. The next morning, Chris was gone. At first, we thought he'd just gone to take a leak or something, but when an hour passed and he still wasn't back, we started to panic. We searched the campsite, called his name, but there was no sign of him. Then Mia found the footprints. They led away from the campsite, deeper into the woods, and they were headed straight for the stairs. "No way," Jake said, shaking his head. "He wouldn't have gone back there." But he did. We followed the footprints, calling Chris's name, but the deeper we went, the heavier the air felt. It was like the woods were closing in around us, like they didn't want us to find him. And then we saw the stairs again. They looked different in the daylight. Older, more worn, like they'd been there for centuries. And at the base of the stairs, we found Chris's hoodie. It was crumpled up, like he'd dropped it in a hurry. "Chris!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the trees. But there was no answer. We searched for hours, days. We even called the police, but they didn't find anything either. It was like Chris had just vanished. But here's the thing. Before he disappeared, Chris had been acting weird. He kept saying he heard something, a voice calling his name. At first, we thought he was just messing with us, but now, I don't know. And then there were the dreams. After Chris disappeared, we all started having the same dream. We'd see him standing at the top of the stairs looking down at us. He'd be smiling, but it wasn't his smile. It was wrong. and then he'd say, "Come up, it's safe up here." We never went back to those woods, but sometimes late at night I still hear his voice, and I wonder, what if we'd gone up those stairs? Would we have found him, or would we have disappeared too? Years later, I found out something that made my blood run cold. I was talking to an old man who lived near those woods, and he told me a story. He said those stairs had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and every few years someone would go missing, always near the stairs. "They're not just stairs," he said. "They're a doorway, but not to anywhere good." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked away. I don't know what happened to Chris. I don't know if he's alive or dead, or if those stairs took him somewhere else. But I do know this. If you're ever in the woods and you see something that doesn't belong, something that feels wrong, don't go near it. Don't touch it. Just turn around and run. Because some doors aren't meant to be opened. So that's my story. I don't know if those stairs were real or if they were something else. But I do know that Chris is gone, and I'll never forget the look on his face in those dreams. If you've ever seen something like this, something that shouldn't exist, let me know in the comments. Because I think there are more of them out there, and I think they're waiting. If you ever think about going camping deep in the woods, don't. I did, and I barely made it out alive. This isn't just some story to scare you. It happened, and every time I close my eyes, I still see it. The shadows, the sounds, that thing watching me from the trees. So if you're planning a weekend getaway in the middle of nowhere, listen carefully, because what happened to me could happen to you. It was supposed to be a fun trip. Just me and my two best friends, Jake and Sam, heading out to this remote campsite Jake found online. No cell service, no people, just pure nature. Sounded perfect. We wanted to disconnect from everything, but we didn't realize just how alone we'd really be. The first day was fine. We set up camp, lit a fire, and joked around like we always did. But that night, something felt off. It wasn't just the usual forest sounds. There was something else, like whispering. At first, I thought it was Jake messing with us, but when I looked over, both he and Sam were fast asleep. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind. But the next morning, things got weirder. Our food bag was torn open, but not by any animal I'd ever seen. The claw marks were deep, too deep, and they weren't even from the same direction, like whatever did it had more than two hands. Jake brushed it off, saying it was probably a raccoon or something. But Sam wasn't so sure. He pointed out strange footprints around the campsite. They weren't like any animal tracks. They were wrong, long, thin, with too many toes. That night we heard it again, the whispering. But this time it was louder, closer, and it wasn't just whispers. It sounded like chanting. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside the tent. The woods were silent, too silent, not even crickets. And then we saw them, glowing eyes, dozens of them just beyond the tree line, staring right at us. Jake yelled, trying to scare them off, but they didn't move. They just kept staring. That's when we realized they weren't animals. They were people, or at least they used to be. We bolted, didn't even bother packing up, just grabbed what we could and ran. But the forest felt different, like it was shifting, trapping us. No matter which way we turned, we ended up back at the campsite. And then we saw it, the thing that had been watching us. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent the wrong way. Its skin looked like tree bark, but its eyes, those eyes were human. Jake tried to fight it. He didn't stand a chance. That thing, it tore him apart like he was nothing. Sam and I ran, but I could hear it chasing us, hear its breath right behind me. I don't know how I made it out. I just kept running until I saw the road, but Sam, he wasn't so lucky. When I looked back, he was gone. They never found Jake or Sam. The police said it was probably a bear attack, but I know the truth. And now, every time I hear the wind whispering through the trees, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. So if you ever think about going camping deep in the woods, don't. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, but when you turned around, no one was there? Imagine feeling that deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with your family fast asleep, and something or someone lurking just beyond the trees. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, my parents, and my little sister Emma. We'd gone camping before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed too quiet, or how the trees felt like they were leaning in, listening to every word we said. But we brushed it off. After all, what could happen in the middle of nowhere? We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. Dad set up the tent while Mom unpacked the cooler. Emma and I wandered off a little to explore, like we always did. But even then I felt it, this weird prickling on the back of my neck, like eyes were following us. I told myself it was nothing. Just the usual jitters you get when you're out in the wild. That night around the campfire, things felt almost normal. We roasted marshmallows, told silly stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. But as the fire died down and the woods grew darker, the feeling crept back in. The forest wasn't just silent, it was too silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, suffocating quiet. We went to bed around midnight. I shared a sleeping bag with Emma, who fell asleep almost immediately. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off. But I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was pitch black, and for a second I didn't know why I'd woken up. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping on the tent wall. Tap, 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 right next to my head. I held my breath, straining to hear. Maybe it was a branch in the wind, but there was no wind. The air was still heavy. I nudged Emma, but she just mumbled and turned over. The tapping stopped, and I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe it was over. But then I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to catch. But it was there. My name. Someone, something, was whispering my name from just outside the tent. I froze. My mind raced with every horror story I'd ever heard. Was it a prank? Some stranger messing with us? But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I wanted to scream for my parents, but I was too scared to make a sound. I just lay there, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever, whatever, was out there could hear it. Then, the zipper. I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of the tent zipper being pulled down. Slowly, deliberately. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The zipper stopped halfway, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then, a hand. A pale, bony hand slipped through the opening, groping blindly in the dark. That was when I finally found my voice. I screamed, loud. Emma shot up, terrified, as my parents burst into the tent with flashlights. But when they shined the light on the zipper, there was nothing there. No hand. No sign that anyone had been there at all. The zipper was closed, like nothing had happened. I tried to explain, but my parents just brushed it off. Bad dream, they said. Just your imagination. But I knew what I saw, and I knew what I heard. The next morning I thought maybe they were right. Maybe it was just a bad dream. But when we stepped outside the tent, my blood ran cold. Footprints. There were footprints all around our campsite, but they weren't from any animal. They were human, barefoot, and they led from the woods right up to our tent. We packed up and left immediately. None of us spoke much on the drive home. But that night, as I lay in my bed far from the woods, I heard it again, a whisper, my name. And this time it was coming from inside the house.